History of the Papacy Podcast, Episode 3, Bishops, Priests, and Deacons. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast. I'm Steve, your host for this podcast about the history of the popes of Rome. Before we get started talking about bishops, I would like to thank Tom Villemer, host of the History of France in English podcast, for his review on iTunes. His podcast on the history of France is refreshing because it takes a look at a subject of history that is often overlooked. Thank you to everyone who has taken time to listen to this podcast and join in on our trip through the history of the Roman popes. Last episode, we talked about the first bishop of Rome, St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, holder of the keys of heaven. I thought a next good stopping point in our journey through the history of the Roman popes would be a look at the ordained clergy of the early church. These would be the bishops, priests, and deacons. The early church had many more offices than this, but these three were the offices that required the apostolic succession. In this episode, we'll try to discuss the roles and duties of deacons, priests, and bishops in some degree of detail. We'll also look at the idea of apostolic succession and why it is so important to the story of the Roman popes. As we learned in the last episode, the Bishop of Rome is not the only high-level bishop to be called pope. The head of Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt was and is called pope to this day. We also learned that the word pope is the English form of the Latin or Greek word papa. In fact, Papa is what the Pope is called in most other languages today. On a side note, the title was probably pronounced as Papa in English during the pre-Great Vowel Shift period, but due to various changes in the sound of vowels in the English language, we now pronounce the word as we do today, Pope. Now, Pope or Papa meant essentially dad. In the early church, the leaders or elders of the community started to emerge. There were the first 12 apostles, then the 70 disciples were chosen after that, then 7 deacons were ordained. The first deacons were actually ordained before the first priests were ordained. Even though priests are of a higher position and rank today, these leaders went out to teach, preach, and lead communities of early Christians, and were given titles to reflect their positions. Deacons comes from the word diakonos, which is a Greek term that meant servant, and the word priest comes from the word presbyteros, which meant simply elder in Greek. Bishop derives from the Greek word episkopos, which was a humble household servant position who basically was an overseer of a wealthy household compared to a head butler. The episkopos of a wealthy Roman household could even be a slave. In the church sense, it was a title that was supposed to instill a sense of humility on the holder and show the bishop was the caretaker of the household of the church. These leaders of the church emerged to organize communities, but they derived their power from one of the original apostles. On a side note, even now, a priest at a Catholic or Orthodox church is called father in English. In other languages and traditions, the priest is called something that denotes leadership or elder status. In traditions where priests can marry, the wife of the priest is often referred to as the female form of elder, such as presbytera. In the Russian and Ukrainian traditions, they are called something akin to mother, such as matushka. As we see, all of the top leadership positions of the church carried very humble titles that were supposed to show leadership, but also fellowship with the community. Deacons, priests, and bishops were all ordained offices in the Roman Catholic, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, the Assyrian Church in the East, and some Protestant traditions with and without the apostolic succession. This means that every deacon, priest, and bishop to this day, in traditions with the apostolic succession, were ordained into their position by someone who was ordained by someone all the way back to one of the original apostles. This method was used and is used today as a way to ensure that the teaching of the apostles and Jesus was being passed down by someone who had the stamp of approval of someone who was approved by an apostle all the way back. Even if the various churches don't agree with each other's teachings on certain issues or aren't in communion with each other, they still often recognize the apostolic succession of each other. One thing to keep in mind is that as of this earliest date in the church, there was no division along the lines of Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant as we see them today. There certainly was differences in teaching and interpretation among the early followers, but the relatively modern differences in theology and doctrinal lines would not be drawn for many centuries in the future. In this episode, I want to focus in on the role of the bishop, but I think it's important to give a summary of the other two ordained offices, deacons and priests. Nearly every Christian denomination uses one or all of these titles. The exact duties and powers of the offices may be different, even drastically different in some of the denominations. But in broad strokes, they all have similar fundamental roles. I will focus on the roles of deacons, priests, and bishops in the early church and in the churches with apostolic succession. Deacons were and still are helpers at the local or parish level of the church. Their various duties are assisting the priest of a parish in liturgical duties, possibly giving the homily or sermon, and other tasks to help the parish and parishioners. The sermon or the homily is the teaching portion of the Mass or liturgy. In fact, the word diakonos, from which we derive the word deacon, means servant in Greek. Now, and from the very beginning, deacons take care of many of the very local issues and take some of the responsibilities off the plate of the priests and the bishops. The first 7 deacons were ordained during the era of the apostles and were given the responsibility of taking care of widows, the elderly, and distributing charity. Interestingly, the first 7 deacons all had Greek names, the first deacon being Stephen. They probably were not pagan converts, but instead they were most likely chosen as leaders from the Hellenistic Jewish community. So far, I haven't said much about the Hellenized Jewish community. The Hellenistic Jewish component was a large and important part of the Jewish community at this time. Jews who spoke Greek and were culturally Greek were often not as likely to follow the Mosaic law as much as some of the other followers were. These Jewish people were cosmopolitan and very much plugged into the culture of Greek learning and philosophy. There was a certain degree of conflict between the Hellenized Jews and their more traditional sects of Judaism. If the first ordained clergy of the earliest church were from this Hellenized Jewish community, it shows that they were a significant part of this early Christian movement. Interestingly, we will see that the Hellenized Jewish component was a large part of the Jewish diaspora in the Roman Empire. There were communities of Jews, and particularly Hellenized Jews, in many areas of the large urban centers of the empire, and not just the eastern portion of the empire either. They were the early adopters of Christianity and were critical to Christianity's spread across the Roman Empire. Some argue this is why Christianity spread so quickly across the Roman Empire, but did not make nearly so much progress in the Persian Empire, right next door. The deacons were mentioned in the Bible before the first priests. Saint Stephen, as I mentioned previously, was among the first 7 deacons and was the first person to be killed or martyred for being a part of the early Christian sect. Deacons are in the apostolic succession, and this office can be a stepping stone towards becoming a priest or a bishop. In some traditions, especially later on, deacons would train and mentor under a bishop. This would fast-track them to jump right to becoming a bishop without being a priest for any length of time. Presbyters, or more commonly known as priests, are the second ordained clerical office, and the word simply means elder. Priests have obviously existed in many other religions that long predate the use of the term by the Christian Church. We could go into the long history of the role of priests and other forms of paganism, but in a future podcast, we will spend some time taking a bird's eye view of the religious situation in the Roman Empire and beyond at this time, and the role of religion in society. In its most basic terms, a priest leads a local community in the Christian Church. The role of the priest in Roman Catholicism, Eastern and Oriental Orthodoxy, and some Protestant denominations are fairly similar. In the Presbyterian Church, the local community is led by a council of elders, hence the name Presbyterian. Priests carry on all of the duties and responsibilities of the deacons, but they also have a number of other duties as well in their job description. A few of the most important duties of the priests is the teaching of the Christian faith, hearing of confession, absolving or binding and loosing of sins, as we learned in previous episodes, along with presiding over the Eucharistic sacrifice. The priests and priesthood have certain connections to the priesthood of the Jews of the Sanhedrin in the temple. Both carried out the sacrifices and had to meet certain requirements to serve as a priest. Christian priests serve in the place of the bishop when the bishop cannot be at the location of the liturgy, which is most often the case. The authority of the priests comes directly through the bishops. Basically, the priest is serving in the place of the bishop and in the name of the bishop. Any power that the priest has is subject to the authority of the bishop. Priests should teach what the bishop says to teach, go to where the bishop tells him to go, and basically do what the bishop says to do. The Christian Church in many ways is very local, but it is also very hierarchical as well. The balance of locality and hierarchy has been an area of conflict in the Christian Church during its entire history. The level of central versus local control will also be a central theme. In large part, the amount of local and central control of teaching and administration is what caused schisms that have happened throughout the history of Christianity. It might be argued that no other religion has had as many breaks and schisms as Christianity has, and this started almost right in the beginning. Now is a good time to explain and discuss what the Eucharistic sacrifice is and how it applies to bishops. Bishops, as the successor of Jesus' first main followers, were entrusted with carrying on the teaching and priestly functions of the early church. A primary priestly function in the new sect was reenacting the Last Supper of Jesus with his apostles. A major change in Christianity from Judaism of that time was the belief that believers no longer had to sacrifice animals to God at the Jerusalem temple. Judaism has obviously changed and evolved from this time as well. Christians' change in doctrine was that Jesus' death was the ultimate and final sacrifice, so those other sacrifices were not necessary going forward. In the Last Supper description from the Bible, Jesus breaks the bread and shares wine, which represents his body and blood. Bishops had the power to perform the liturgical duties which would recreate this change. This is the doctrine in the Roman Catholic and other churches who subscribe to this idea as transubstantiation, or the mystery of communion. At every Mass or liturgy until this day, according to the Roman Catholic and other traditions, the bread and wine are actually turned into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. This is the Eucharistic sacrifice. Many Protestants don't subscribe to the notion that the Eucharist is really changed, but instead it is more of a symbolic change. But in the Roman Catholic Church, this is a huge part of the bishop's authority. Only priests and bishops can perform this duty, and priests perform it in the place of the bishop. During this earliest time, bishops were able to perform this function for all of the believers. But as the movement quickly grew, bishops took on a more supervisory role, and the priests began carrying this duty out at the local level. Deacons cannot perform this duty or sacrifice. Bishops delegating this power to other elders in the community would begin to build the foundation of the authority and focus power into bishops and patriarchs, continuing us on the path to the power of the Roman Pope. The priest-bishop relationship, in my opinion, is the synthesis of the situation that was going on in Judea and Syria at this time. There was a complicated and oftentimes chaotic mix of factors going on religiously and politically at this time and place. Local Jewish teachers were starting to emerge as a separate institution from the temple priest. This carries on to the modern day. The local teachers in Judaism are called rabbis, which means teacher or master. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the focus of the Jewish religion turned outward and refocused on the local teacher or rabbi. This change in focus would have also affected the early Christian communities. Judaism lost its official central point and couldn't develop a mechanism to replace that because of the policy of the Romans. The role of the temple in Jerusalem is still central to Judaism. The role of the Jerusalem temple was not central to Christianity, and it had the bishop organizational structure to replace it. In fact, the early teachings of the church, even before the destruction of the temple, were to separate the followers of Jesus from temple worship. The Bible is full of verses that show the central focus of the new religion would not center around the temple. In fact, the temple would be destroyed by the Romans just a generation later. This shift in focus in administration and authority, as well as its flexibility, was a reason why the early Christian church was able to spread so quickly throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The apostolic succession from Jesus to apostles to bishops to priests gave the early bishops legitimacy to teach and spread their message. It also gave the bishops the influence and organizational structure to gain converts in the highly competitive religious market that was the Roman Empire of that time. Speaking of organizational structures emerging, at this earliest point, the convention was that one bishop would serve one geographic area, generally a city. Pretty soon after, a hierarchical structure would start to emerge. Bishops who oversaw other bishops came about next. Pretty soon after, a hierarchical structure would begin to emerge. Bishops oversaw other bishops. The modern hierarchical structure was beginning to appear at this time, but wouldn't be formally put in place until the first ecumenical councils a few hundred years later. In the modern Roman Catholic Church and other churches with an episcopal structure follow a similar structure. There is a local bishop who oversees several parishes in a diocese. The diocese system was used in the Roman Empire and was adopted by the Christian Church. In Europe, the modern dioceses used by the Church very closely follow the original diocese from the time of Diocletian. The diocese system was developed by Diocletian as a reform of the provinces. Over the local bishops was an archbishop who administers several dioceses. The archbishop, whose throne is in a large city, may be called a metropolitan bishop. Eventually, the bishops of the largest cities in the Roman Empire were given the title of patriarch. Initially, there were patriarchates in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, the first being in Jerusalem. Constantine would make his own town, Constantinople, into a patriarchate as well. There was an order of precedence of these patriarchs. Rome was given first place in the precedence due to Rome's status as the capital of the empire and the throne of St. Peter. It didn't give it an absolute supremacy, though, but the Patriarch of Rome would begin to take on more powers and authority. This is going to be a major theme that will develop. In the near future, bishops will begin to take on characteristics of secular leaders, such as thrones, elaborate vestments, crowns, and other regalia. Clerical structures and clerical offices are an important part of this story, and one we will be looking into more. A future podcast will outline the religious situation of the Roman Empire, and particularly the situation for Jewish and early Christians in Rome and the large imperial cities. In the first few years after the time of Jesus, the church was beginning to organize itself. Some of it was directly from the organization of the apostles, but a leadership was emerging based on the rapidly changing situation of the time. There were many different teachings going on, and leaders would have to step up to debate and solve the pressing issues that were coming up. In the next episode, we will look at the first meeting of the apostles and early church founders to discuss some of the first controversial issues to develop in the church. The Apostolic Council, or Council of Jerusalem, is really fascinating to me. It will also set the stage for how controversies will be dealt with in the future. The council will develop into the main problem-solving mechanism for the church for centuries after this first council in Jerusalem. An interesting podcast to check out if you would like to learn more about the Bible is The Human Bible by Dr. Robert Price. He takes an academic view of the Bible. It is a great resource to learn more about the Bible and biblical criticism. And he always has a segment where he explains a concept from the Bible or biblical analysis called Up to Speed. His point of view is that of a secular humanist, but he is fair and respectful to those who disagree with him. I hope you have enjoyed this overview of bishops. I have really had a lot of fun researching this topic and trying to wrap my mind around all the facets of this important topic. Please post questions or comments on the Facebook page, the History of the Papacy podcast. Send an email to historyatozpage@gmail.com. That's historyatozpage@gmail.com, or check out the website at historyatozpage@libsyn.com. That's historyatozpage@libsyn.com. Really appreciate and love to hear any feedback you have on the content of the program or anything else. Thank you very much for listening. I hope to hear from you, and I'll see you at the next stop on our trip through papal history.